My name is Peter Murphy from the Politics in the Pub Committee. I'm the MC tonight. Welcome all of you out there in the ether. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation where I am, and we can all pay respect to the elders of the land on which we all are today. The topic tonight is Iran takes Australian hostages. What is happening in the Persian Gulf? So tonight we're shifting our focus from the pandemic, the economic crisis, capitalism, etc., to an important international flashpoint, the Persian Gulf. Australia has had diplomatic relations with Iran from the time of the Shah in 1974. Our foreign affairs establishment is particularly proud of that. On the other hand, every year Australia co-sponsors a Canadian resolution at the UN General Assembly that criticises the shocking human rights record of Iran. Australia's low-profile presence in Iran got shaken up in July last year when two young travel bloggers, Jolie King and Mark Perkin, were arrested for taking drone images somewhere near a military site. They were released in October last year in an apparent prisoner swap for an Iranian doctoral student from Brisbane who was facing extradition to the USA for alleged sanction-busting activity. But about that time, the British media revealed that a UK-Australian citizen, Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, had been in prison for almost a year, and that was part of a 10-year sentence for alleged spying. The Australian government continues to urge calm to her family and friends, asking that they be allowed to quietly negotiate for her release. That strategy doesn't seem to be working. The larger context has been the extreme pressure from the Trump administration on Iran over its nuclear program, and Australia agreeing to contribute quite token naval and air forces to protection of tankers, oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. Our speakers tonight are specialists in this area, which is largely ignored in Australia's media and public debate. Why are these Australians being grabbed now? What could Australia's government do in this new situation? What can the Australian public do? Why is it happening? So our speakers, Karim Pourhamzavi, he's teaching at the Department of Modern History, Politics and International Relations at Macquarie University. His current research focuses on the historical correlation between jihadist movements and global hegemony. Karim's research within the discipline of international political economy is a sub-branch of political science and has produced multiple publications in English and Farsi. He's been a visiting fellow at Lund University and at Glasgow University. And Greg Barton is now the Professor of Global Islamic Politics at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University in Melbourne. He began his academic career lecturing at Monash University in 1993. At Deakin, he became an Associate Professor of Politics by the time he left there in 2005. He was an Associate Professor at the Honolulu-based Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in 2006 and 7, after which he served as an adjunct professor. He returned to Australia that year and accepted the position of Herb Feith Research Professor for the study of Indonesia at Monash University, and now is in his current position. So they're really well qualified for tackling tonight's topic. The first speaker is Karim Pourhamzavi. Each speaker will present for about 20 minutes or up to 20 minutes, and then we'll go straight into the question and answer session until we've dealt with all the questions or we reach 8:15, whichever comes first. People can put their questions in the Q&A facility on the Zoom screen. We'll see where we are at the end of the presentations with the questions. So please welcome Karim Pourhamzavi to the microphone. Go ahead, Karim.
Thank you, Peter. Today I'm going to talk about the topic from an international political economic perspective for two reasons. First, to provide a larger or broad picture which involves Australian Middle Eastern relationship, and then to narrow down this topic to the micro level of Iranian-Australian relationship. And hopefully by the end of this, we can make sense of why, for instance, Australian citizens are getting arrested or hostages in Iran by the Iranian authority, of course. The second reason is because the second part of the topic, what is happening in the Persian Gulf, is really part of and continuation of what is happening in the region for the last 200 years and so. This of course involves global rivalries in which Australia plays a part. The Middle East and the Persian Gulf has been attractive for global power throughout modern history. This can by itself be divided into two sections of discovering and exploiting Middle Eastern oil, and then after this period. Through the 19th century, the Middle East and the Persian Gulf was particularly attractive for geostrategic reasons. For instance, as we can understand from the British officials, the colony of India was so crucial for the British Empire, and that's why regions such as Iran and Afghanistan has to be dominated in order to safeguard that colony. Steadily, the Persian Gulf gained its own significance for the colonial powers. Like by the end of 19th century, over 80% of the trade was conducted by British subjects, and over a period of 50 years, we are speaking about over 20,000 of British trading ships and steamers. So huge interest in terms of trade. Also, another aspect of the significance of the region was, particularly after the American Civil War, some regions such as Egypt and Iran were important for growing crops for international markets, or such as cotton in Iran and both cotton in Egypt and both cotton and opium in Iran. In the first decade of the 20th century, precisely the Iranian oil was significant for the British to actually win the two world wars, the first and the second one. In the first World War, exploiting the Iranian oil was so crucial for the British that Churchill himself was in charge of the project. Because that's the oil was to turn the British, the engine of the British Navy from steamers and coal-based engines to oil, and that was something that only the British could do, and Britain could do, and that gave them an upper hand in the First World War. In the Second World War, also, like oil-thirsty Germany and the whole industrial project of Germany needed oil, which the Soviet Union, as the only supplier, was preventing selling oil to Germany, and again taking over as an occupation of Iran in 1941, taking over the Iranian oil by the British was also crucial to win the Second World War. So this is the dynamic of global rivalry over the last 200 years. But when it comes to Australia and even New Zealand, the definition of the state in these two countries is they define themselves as part of a larger alliance. Be it the Commonwealth, for instance, or even Western Bloc. In different time and place, different titles were picked. For instance, some would prefer a capitalist alliance during the Cold War. But anyway, there is something that makes the foreign policies in these two states unique compared to even other hegemonic and Western allies. I find that, and by foreign policy here, I mean the involvement of Australia in overseas and imperial wars. Also, you have to know that we are speaking about minor as a minor party. I'm not comparing Australia here with Britain, but also there was certain involvement. Probably the best way to summarize and describe this is a quote from the New Zealand Prime Minister Michael Savage in 1939, before New Zealand involved in the Second World War, when he referred to the Queen as "wherever she goes, we go." Similar quotations and tendency can be found among Australian politicians at the time, and that all of this mean that wherever Britain involved in a certain war, and here I'm talking about the Middle East, these two states will follow. So this particular character or characteristic distinguish Australian foreign policy even from other Western allies. And by allies, I mean allies of a specific hegemonic power, first Britain, and then after Second World War, the US. This, if we can put it in a form of like absolute loyalty to the global power, is kind of different from, for instance, European stance, when their foreign policy is more based on calculation of the cost and benefit of their action. For instance, France and Germany, they both opposed the occupation of Iraq, and they didn't involve in that. And even Britain, which is known as the strongest U.S. ally, in the recent summit in the UN Security Council, they voted alongside other European and even China and Russia when the United States was demanding the increase of sanction as a result of pulling over of the nuclear deal with Iran. And we have to note also both policies are conscious. Like the European were consciously planning when they were planning the next stage of their alliance with the United States in the post-colonial period. They were determining that yes, we are part of this alliance, but for instance, when our interests demand and when we can, we would take an independent stance. Also, we usually hear in Australia, we hear a lot about the Anzac War, which happened to be tragic for the involved forces, the British, New Zealand, and Australian forces. But paying attention to the details of other wars that Australia was involved in also help us to unpack the complexity of this alliance and the history of it. I have two examples here. The first was in the First World War, or precisely in 1916, when Britain was able to make an agreement with the Arabs to turn against their previous allies, the Ottoman Empire, and basically by promising them an Arab state, which later the British didn't give that to the Arabs. But anyway, in 1916, the Arabs were willing to fight beside the British and French forces against the Ottomans. One of these battles, which proved to be difficult for the Allied forces, was in Damascus, which in many ways was the second capital city of the Ottomans. It was well defended, and it wasn't easy to even infiltrate the city. So it was sieged for several months, and eventually in 1918 it fell, and the Allied forces were able to enter the city. So the Australian forces were the first forces to enter the city, at least from the eastern gate. The second example is actually about Iran in 1941, when the Iranian state was subject to occupation by mainly three global forces, global powers, UK and the United States and the Soviet Union from when they occupied the northern territories of Iran. Of course, each of these global powers had their own motivation for that occupation, but again, the first navy to land on Iranian soil was the Australian Navy, or among the first forces to land on Iranian, or also the Australian forces. Australia maintains similar strong allies with the United States, which emerged as a global hegemon power after the Second World War. The Cold War also turned the Middle East as an entire as a state entirely state. As a stage for a proxy conflict between this time Western Bloc and Eastern Bloc. But post-Cold War even turned more dramatic for the Middle Eastern states. And from 2003 and starting from the occupation of Iraq, series of war and interventions took place in the Middle East, which Australia again found a place in most of them. This again, as we talked, like some European powers didn't support all of these interventions, and they dealt with them case by case. For instance, in the Iraqi case, some of the European powers didn't participated in that war, but in the Libyan case, all of them, or through NATO, the Libyan state was invaded. So let's come to the more recent Iranian-Australian relationships. Well, Iran is subject to sanctions, and most of the sanctions are approved by the UN, and nobody can blame anyone, including Australia, for taking part of the sanctions against Iran. But what I'm talking here about are sanctions that took place after the US withdrawal from the nuclear deal, which was signed between Iran and some 6 global powers. And the Trump administration returned back some of the sanctions, or even imposed more sanctions on Iran. Again, well, the Europeans, they didn't want to, or they don't want to jeopardize their interest and their trade with both US and regional allies such as Saudi Arabia and others. But they have their own say when it comes to sanctions against Iran, including the recent summit in the UN. They voted against renewing the sanctions, and they committed to what they have signed in the nuclear deal. This is not the position of Australia. For instance, when there is US sanctions against Iran, Australia take that seriously. Then again, in a recent tension between US and Iran, this tension was not entirely based on economic sanctions. Part of it was even military pressure. The two states were so close to get into war against each other. As a result of, or part of this tension, Trump administration declared the departure of global forces to protect the Persian Gulf. Well, this plan didn't work well, firstly, because it wasn't practical. In both sides of the Persian Gulf, there are sovereign states. Again, the whole process is highly costing. And what's the legal base for that? Is it a new colonization or what? So even among the very few countries which supported that, including Britain, which symbolically sent a battleship and then withdraw it back, Australia also supported this US administration plan. What I'm trying to say here is the tension in the Iranian-Australian relationship already exists. The relationship is not normal. So we are not talking about, for instance, Australia-Saudi Arabia relationship. So having this in the background, or let's turn to another flashback. What is happening in Iran and what's the nature of politics there, and how this may enable us to understand why would the Iranian authority take the Australian citizens, or some of them, as hostages. The current ruling elite and political establishment in Iran are product of what happened in 1979. The event is commonly referred to as a revolution, but I don't think technically it is accurate to call that revolution for many reasons, which are not relevant to today's topic. But one reason is there is no revolution that gives birth to, for instance, a theocratic political establishment. As is the case in Iran, and Iran is actually the only theocracy in the world. So as a result of that, as a result of the coming into power of the Islamists in 1979, mass executions happened and followed. We don't have the actual numbers. Some would say thousands, or actually tens of thousands. Some observers, such as Robert Fix, who spent time in Iran during in 1979, would say that the numbers are hundreds of thousands. So high brutality against Iranian society. Then at the same time, in 1981, Iraq launched a large-scale war against Iran that happened, that continued for 8 years. Iraq itself was supported by both Western and Eastern powers, including some regional Arab states. But again, another factor that turned too dramatic on the Iranian society was this international sanctions, which took place as early as 1981. Well, it is simplification if we say it's make Iranian society poorer than it was, because we are talking about a society which some 80% of the society can easily be identified as the margin of the society. And like what it means, that's the largest section of the Iranian population are living either on poverty or below poverty line. So you would imagine what would sanctions deal with that. And another example that happened in the neighboring countries to Iran, none of the states which were subject to international sanctions, Iraq, Syria, Libya, to different extents, Yemen, ended up in a like pleasant fate, if you can put it that way. In all of this state, the sanctions destroyed the fabric of the societies there, and the subsequent interventions destroyed the very notion of the states and the societies. So this is the model that put forward to the Iranian society, and somehow they are being punished for something that they haven't done in 1979. And this is another reason that's not accurate to call what happened there as a revolution, because one has to distinguish between Iranian society and the ruling elite. Well, I can't say that the ruling elite are in a bad conditions as the Iranian society, but as we can imagine that they also have limited options when it comes to foreign policy. Here, what I can call, so Iran is the weakest party when it comes to any relationship, Australian-Iranian relationship, or even as part of the tension between Iran and regional powers such as Saudi Arabia and Israel. Iran is the weak party. And the weak party tend toward what I call unconventional politics. I can give an example. For instance, Iranian ruling elite spent most of the resources in the country to develop a missile program, and they were successful in developing that. Not because they are good in industry or anything else. It was highly costly project, but because nobody sell them a weapon. They can't buy a weapon. Through this unconventional politics, we can understand why the Iranian authority taking literally hostages. So they take hostage to take some concessions, particular political concessions, including exchange of prisoners. Within this dynamic, I mean, why would someone take hostages? They want something in return. In this dynamic, we can understand that why, for instance, the Iranian authorities hold these Australian citizens, probably the Australian authority is right. They are negotiating a deal currently with the Iranian authorities to see what they can give and how can they get people like Dr. Gilbert released from the unfair prison that she is in currently. I will leave it here, Peter.
Thank you very, very much, Karim, for that backgrounding and sort of a realistic conclusion at the end about the context in which these events are happening recently with Australians in Iran. So I'd now like to hand over to Greg Barton, and I'll make him a host so you can do your slides. So over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Karim. Karim's given a nice broad context to understand what we're discussing tonight. I'll sort of dive into some of the details and present a very simple presentation, trying to make sense of what some of the main elements are. So this is not a very sophisticated take. I'm not an Iran specialist, so I'll start with that caveat. But I think some of the broad issues are clear enough and important enough that we can get into discussing them. So one of the reasons we're having this topic tonight, I mean, I think we would have been talking about this in any case, but this brings into the frame a very personal note, a very disturbing note to discussing the question of why states like Iran do what they do, and in particular why they take political prisoners, as we're arguing. So Kylie Moore-Gilbert has now been in Iranian detention for 2 years, and most of that 2 years has been in some of the harshest conditions. Well, all of the 2 years have been in very difficult prisons, often in solitary confinement, now in Karchak prison, which is one of Iran's most notorious prisons, perhaps the most notorious women's prison, very violent and dangerous place. And this was a story that wasn't much discussed in recent years because there was the quiet confidence that quiet diplomacy behind the scene would save the day and bring about her release. That's still the hope. This will require quiet diplomacy, and the work that DFAT is doing is essential to securing Kylie's release. But since her recent transfer to Karchak prison, a number of Kylie's friends felt that now's the time to speak up a bit more directly about her case. Not to criticize DFAT, but rather to try and strengthen their arm in doing what's very, very difficult work negotiating. And I'll give my personal take on what I think some of the dynamics going on are and why securing her release and the release of others is so difficult. So Kylie was at a short workshop conference. She was invited by the Iranian state back in August of 2018. She elected to spend a few extra weeks visiting Tehran and speaking to people in Iran because she was very excited to be visiting Iran. She's not an Iran specialist, works on the Gulf, works on Arab states in the Gulf, but Iran is so important that she was excited to be there. But unfortunately, as she was leaving Tehran airport, she was detained. The authorities accused her of espionage. The particular authorities involved was the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. We'll speak about them in a minute because it's key to understanding why her situation is so difficult. The federal government has, throughout this 2 years, maintained that it's the highest priority to secure her release. But there is this frustrating mystery as to why we don't seem to have seen the progress you would expect in a case like this. Kylie was taken into Evin prison in Tehran, which is a difficult prison, but she was taken into Ward 2A, which is a section run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. In other words, a section of a notorious prison run to hold political prisoners, generally, for the most part, seen to be those taken hostage by the Revolutionary Guard for political purposes. And the conditions of that Ward 2A are described as being quite horrendous and often, at least in many cases, involve deliberate psychological pressure to break down those being detained, to make them more valuable, more malleable to signing confessions or making statements, which will help in that hostage-taking process. In other words, the negotiations behind their release. Of course, there have been many people held in Evin prison. More recently, Jolie King and Mark Firkin, two young Australians travelling around the world, driving overland through Asia and West Asia and the Middle East. Their trip came to an abrupt halt when they were arrested in Iran. As Karim was saying, the charges then were that they were flying a drone in an area close to military facilities, probably an unwitting error. It's understandable they did make a transgression of local law. They were detained for a period of time. Their release, as Karim was saying, was negotiated. In some ways, their case is understandable. They made a mistake, not out of bad intention or any sort of knowing intention. And fortunately, their release was secured, but it did involve some sort of quid pro quo. The question is, what mistake did Kylie make, and why has there been no deal forthcoming? And I'll try and unpack what I think might be going on there. Of course, the taking of people into detention and charging them often with espionage charges is a common pattern, and it's commonly seen as a sort of hostage-taking effort in a bid to try and get some sort of quid pro quo negotiation. It's become fairly routine for Westerners to be detained in Iran. It has to be said, though, that the more common targets are people born in Iran. They may hold dual passports, dual citizenship, but their Iranian heritage and their dual citizenship gives them a particular vulnerability. A pattern we're seeing, of course, with China and elsewhere. Sometimes the targets are fairly high profile. So Jason Rezaian, who was bureau chief of the Washington Post in Tehran, his wife is Iranian, was abruptly arrested, charged on espionage charges, held in pretty tough conditions. But eventually, this was during the Obama administration, his release was negotiated. Now, if he'd been detained at this time under the Trump administration, perhaps we wouldn't have seen the same progress. It's a even more difficult time. But in some ways, the logic of detaining a high-profile American and trying to extract some sort of deal for his release is something that we can guess at and understand. It has to be said, though, that a lot of the people detained, as I said, are dual nationals and, of course, Iranian citizens themselves, just regular Iranian citizens protesting, perhaps, or caught up in protests, or perhaps politically active. So we have many cases. Nazarene Zaghari Ratcliffe is a high-profile case, justifiably high-profile. She fortunately has been allowed out of prison detention, still under house arrest, wearing an ankle bracelet tracking her movements. the COVID-19 conditions have hit Iran very hard, and of course they've hit Iranian prisons, as you'd expect, given the pretty rough conditions there, very hard. So Nazarine was held in Evin prison. Fortunately, political pressure was applied, and she's been allowed to stay with her parents in West Tehran. Still a pretty terrible situation, still very, very concerning. The hope for Kylie Moore Gilbert would be that she might be released from Karchak prison and released into the care and responsibility of the Australian Embassy, where she would be safer from COVID-19 and would have a chance to restore her physical and mental health. But there are a number of cases, I won't go into them all, but it's fair to say there's a pattern of behaviour here. It's generally understood that, as I said, when Westerners or dual nationals are taken and detained, it's because they're seen as being political pawns. They're being detained on the scope of being leveraged for political concessions. And of course, the situation when it involves the Revolutionary Guard, which is a state within the state, and I'll talk about that in a minute, means that that political negotiation aspect is even more clear-cut than when it comes to regular prisoners. Of course, there are almost literally countless Iranians who have been arrested. Some of them very high profile. Some of them sadly have been executed, such as the very tragic case with Navid Afkari, who was executed just days ago. He was caught up in protests back in 2018. It was alleged that he had knifed a security guard in that protest, and he was forced to sign a confession that was said that he was tortured in prison and under duress signed a statement. In any case, the state pressed ahead and executed him. This is just one case amongst many, many cases. So here the state was not looking for concessions. The state was simply intimidating ordinary Iranians and saying that even if you're as high profile as Navid was, that doesn't make you safe. And it should be explained, by the way, that in Iran, wrestling is the #1 sport. So if you're a famous national wrestler, you're a celebrity. And taking a celebrity, charging them, and then finally executing them is a reminder to all Iranians that anyone can be subject to the same fate. So it's about the use of intimidation and violence to control the population. We've had many reports of COVID-19 running rampant through Iranian jails, not because anyone wishes that to be so, just because the conditions there are already so awful that they're particularly vulnerable. And of course, Iran as a whole has been very badly hit by COVID-19. There have been many reports coming out of prisons like Greater Tehran Penitentiary and Evin Prison talking about the horrendous conditions there. There have been some really high-profile, very committed professional human rights activists, including Iranian human rights lawyer Nazarine Sotoudeh, who's currently on a hunger strike, and reportedly her health is in very poor condition. She's been on this hunger strike just recently, trying to highlight the very dire conditions of COVID-19. Now, many prisoners, including many political prisoners, have been released partly for this reason in recent months, but clearly more needs to be done. And this is a pattern that goes back decades. So the author Marina Nemeth, when she was a teenager, was arrested and sent to Evin prison back in 1982. So 38 years ago, the conditions she described then are conditions that are described today. It's not a recent development, and it's not just recent politics that explains what's happening, although recent politics have put this into a focus. Of course, there's been a number of very large protests against the Iranian regime, protesting unnecessary pressure on voting, because Iran still does have voting, still does have elections. So people feel committed enough about that process that they want to protest when they see things being unfair. I won't go into details of all the protests, but in recent years, including as recently as last year before COVID broke out, when there were nationwide protests at the time in December last year, people talked about it as being a tipping point. Of course, these things up until now haven't been tipping points, but hundreds were arrested and many were killed in the process. And the reports coming out from groups like Amnesty International suggest deliberate use of violence to intimidate and to basically send a signal to others that they shouldn't think of being involved. I mentioned that Ward 2A in Evin Prison is a section of the prison system, or it's a sort of almost a parallel element in the prison system run by the Revolutionary Guard. In fact, there's a very large parallel system. In fact, Iran has a system of parallel institutions, including parallel prisons. And partly it's because the state isn't a monolith. The state has parallel institutions within it, and the most important being the Revolutionary Guard. In a recent report in the US Department of State, a report to Congress on people that the Department of State was saying were responsible for human rights abuses in Iran. It's interesting to look at the names. Prominent amongst the names that come up, of course, are people in the military and in intelligence, but many of them are specifically associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. And that speaks to the concern with the Revolutionary Guard. So I just want to conclude this brief presentation by talking a little bit about the Revolutionary Guard Corps. I'll draw on a recent report by the Council of Foreign Relations, the report that came out in May of last year, as a way of sketching out the key things to understand. So, of course, there was a revolution in Iran in 1979. The revolution had a broad alliance of different groups who were unhappy with the Shah's rule and wanted change. The revolution at the time was seen in many ways to have prominent left-wing elements. One of the elements in the revolution that was not properly anticipated at the time was the religious element, the religious political element, and of course that element dominated. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps came out of that 1979 revolution. It has grown through the 8-year war with Iraq that followed, that Karim spoke about, to become a parallel, not just a parallel state, but a parallel military. So it's not just a small elite unit. It's running large ground forces, large naval forces. It even runs an air force of sorts, mainly concerned with strategic missiles. And it runs a civil militia, the Basiji militia that you often hear about when it comes to plainclothes, thugs basically using force to crack down on demonstrators or protesters, or routinely spying on ordinary Iranians for all sorts of alleged misdoings. It's basically a thuggish paramilitary under the control now of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, not initially so, but now under their control, and used as a way of multiplying their force. So unusual to have such a large parallel military. They take the titles of being guardians of the revolution. Of course, the revolution, as I said, had many different elements at play, but the religious element came to the fore, and the IRGC was founded as a way of giving some military strength to this Islamic leadership under Khomeini, recognizing that given that the Shah had been brought down by a revolution, that they also could suffer the same fate, and they needed some sort of ballast and some sort of loyal military force to balance the Iranian military force. So they have ground forces across all 31 provinces of Iran and the capital Tehran. As I said earlier, more than 100,000 troops. They've got 6 times that many with the Basij paramilitary force. They run some very unusual naval forces, not a regular navy, but a fast-moving sort of marine force, but with quite strong 20,000 patrolling the Straits of Hormuz, particularly paying attention to oil shipping. The Air Force, as I said, is not a regular Air Force. It's really in charge of Iran's ballistic missile program, which is pretty important when you think about it. They also have a cyber command, which is involved in extremely sophisticated and effective hacking and cyber operations. One of the best in the world, alongside those run by Russia and China. Of course, Russia and China are much more powerful. Iran is less powerful, but in some ways, this cyber division is a weapon of the week when it comes to Iran. The Revolutionary Guard is an economic powerhouse. It controls perhaps as much as a third of Iran's economy. And a key thing to understand, this is not new, but it's become sharpened with recent restrictions and further sanctions, as Karim was speaking about, precisely because Iran has faced a series of sanctions. It's distorted the way in which the economy works. It's given particular advantage and leverage to aspects of the black market, and the Revolutionary Guard has proven itself supremely able in this black market domain, running various obvious sanction busting activities, but all sorts of odd and unlikely programs around the world, including with groups like Hezbollah that it funds and controls, as a way of generating hard currency and accessing foreign exchange that can't be regularly accessed by the Iranian system. And it has a number of elements within it, but the Quds Force in particular has been called out as being the element of the Revolutionary Guard most involved in terrorist operations and most involved in links with groups like Hezbollah. Now, you know, there's lots of things said about Iran and terrorism, but there isn't the organic grassroots terrorism in Iran that we see across Sunni states. It's a different dynamic, so the word terrorism is a little bit confusing, although when you look at groups like Hezbollah, you can see that the word is certainly appropriate. But there have been a number of extrajudicial killings and operations alleged to be orchestrated by the Quds Force out of Iranian diplomatic bases. And of course, in the case of Hezbollah, it's more of a full-blown and open program. And of course, within Iran, the Revolutionary Guard Corps plays this key role of protecting the regime and literally giving them a Praetorian Guard, lest the public should become so upset with the regime that it moves against it. So whether it's by intimidation through the Basij, or whether it's by rounding up and arresting and detaining in special prisons or special sections of prisons, ordinary Iranians, this is really basic substance of what the Revolutionary Guard does. But it's also active internationally, and of course, more recently, its activities in providing leadership and direction in Iraq and in Syria have become very clear. There's been this long association with Hezbollah and Lebanon, but now we see very active engagement in Iraq and Syria. We also see more overt activity within Afghanistan and within the Palestinian territories. It's a very complicated story, but it's the story behind the targeted killing, the assassination of General Soleimani. No question, Soleimani had blood on his hands, a lot of blood, an immense amount of violence. Whether his targeted killing, that strike, was a wise or sensible move at the time is another issue entirely. But it shows the high stakes game that the Revolutionary Guard is involved in and what's going on. And it makes sense when you think about hostage taking, that the hostage taking, if it's not for money, is often for an exchange of prisoners, so-called. And because of what the Revolutionary Guard has been doing in the region and beyond, there are a lot of people that it wants released from prisons in which Western powers have some sway or seem to have some sway. It's hard to see what the Revolutionary Guard sees that the Australian government would give up. It's true that the two travellers we spoke about earlier, there was the exchange, as Karim said, of this PhD student. It's not clear that anyone is being held in Australian detention who would be subject to some sort of prisoner swap. It's perhaps the hope is that Australia will put pressure on America or Britain or elsewhere. It's really not clear. It's also not clear why, if this is not the case, the Australian government's not working with regional powers such as Qatar, for example, that has a long history of having to deal with the Revolutionary Guard and having to negotiate, not out of any a close association, but out of a real politic. So there is the possibility that sort of negotiation might be helpful in a case like this. But I mean, there's a lot that we don't know. But what is pretty clear in many of these cases is that the force behind the detention and the harsh conditions designed to break people down and the forced confessions is this political game of taking people hostage, not just as political prisoners, but as hostages in the hope of securing something in return. And that's the larger picture here in the case of somebody like Karim Gilbert and others. And that's a really difficult thing to deal with. And that explains why it's taken more than 2 years to secure Kali's release. But it's also the reason why we have to speak up and ask that efforts are redoubled, because conditions in these jails are awful at the best of times with COVID-19. They're more than awful. Plus we have a lot of evidence that the Revolutionary Guard uses really instruments of torture, at least psychological, if not physical, in every case, to break people down and to make them malleable, to extract something from them. And that means that for people like Kali, these are very dangerous conditions. Karchak prison, we can discuss more, but it's regarded as one of the most notorious in Iran and the most notorious women's prison. Many of the inmates there are violent individuals. There's problems all the time with violence, and so it's a dangerous place to be at the best of times. Hence the sense of urgency in this particular case, but it's not just for Kali. It's this concern should be for many other people, but it needs to be read within that context. So I'll leave the slides there, and we can go back to you as host if you like, Peter, and have a discussion.
Okay, you can do that. That's great. Okay, thank you very much to Greg and to Karim. That's really very strong input. We've got a few people with us. So what I thought I'd do, okay. Right early in the process of developing this event tonight, I asked another well-informed person on Iran, Alison Bronowski, if she would be interested in speaking, which she declined to do that, but asked for something to be read out to the gathering. And I'll do this as like the first of the Q&A comment things. So you'll find this interesting. She said, I have often had the pleasure of joining Politics in the Pub meetings, and I would happily have been here this evening, but I'm not able to make a case for Dr. Karim Gilbert against the government of Iran, which is what I was asked to do. It's not quite accurate, but anyway. I don't know anything about her activities in Iran, and if any of you do, you might inform the media, which are as ignorant as I am. If she and the 2 other Australians arrested for espionage at the same time were spying, it's strange that they were quickly released and she was not. I do know a bit about Iran, having lived there for 2 years, and after that staying in touch with friends and events there. Iran lost its first and only opportunity to be a democracy in 1953, when the CIA and MI6 collaborated in overthrowing the elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and replacing him with Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, son of the former Shah, whose rule ended with the Islamic Revolution in '79. Human rights under the Ayatollahs are much the same as they were under the Shahs. Whose fault is it that Iran is not a democracy? If we want to criticize the human rights of Iran, why do we not also mention India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, and numerous other countries? Before we do, we should admit that UN inspectors have repeatedly criticized Australia's treatment of refugees and Indigenous people. If we are as concerned about the international rules-based order, in quotes, as our governments claim, why do ministers not complain to the UK government about holding an Australian without charge, without proper health care or access to lawyers, in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison, where 2 people have died of COVID-19. Why do ministers not intervene with the US administration and urge them to drop the espionage charges against him, for which his alleged co-conspirator, twice jailed, has been pardoned and freed? If justice is blind, why does it matter that the prisoner is Julian Assange? I don't know why Dr. Moore Gilbert is accused of spying. I do know why Assange is, because in 2010 he published the truth about American human rights abuses in Iraq and Afghanistan. He is seriously ill and may die before they extradite him to the US to face 175 years in prison. In the UK or in the US, he may be found dead of suicide in his cell, just like Jeffrey Epstein. Ministers doing their best for Dr. Moore Gilbert will have Assange's death on their conscience, because for him they did nothing. So it's a tour de force, but it's like a pushback, I think, from that bit of opinion in Australia, which is doubtful about the charges against Iran in general. Anyway, if either of you, if you would like to comment on that, do so now, and I'll look for the Q&A and to see if we've got any questions.
Yeah, Peter, I'm happy to make a comment briefly on that for what it's worth. And I, don't know the broader context, and I won't engage with all the issues of the statement, but just say that, I fully agree that there is a lot of injustice around the world, and there's a lot of cases where we need to speak up. But that should never be the basis for not speaking up when there are egregious cases and we have a particular personal responsibility. So, yes, I think there are many cases we should speak up, including the case of Julian Assange. I think his behaviour is reckless and problematic, but I don't think he should be extradited to the US, and I think we should be concerned about his health. This concern about possible mental health breakdown it's very worrying. So no argument against that. But what has that got to do with the case of Kylie Moore Gilbert? Julian Assange did something, we can debate his motive, but it was a political action. I think it was reckless, but I can see that it's brought attention to some important issues that need to see the light of day, so I acknowledge that. But he was a political actor. There's nothing about Kylie Moore Gilbert's case to suggest any intention for any sort of political action, much less espionage. She's been under a lot of pressure in prison, reportedly, to turn and to act in a role to support the Revolutionary Guard. She said that she's never been a spy for any state, never will be. She's refused to bow to that pressure. There's no evidence whatsoever to support the espionage charges. The Revolutionary Guard and other elements of the Iranian state as well often bring such charges against people in a way that's completely baseless. But it's a pretext for basically, putting a gun to somebody's head and saying, we're going to fire unless you respond to our demands. So it's crude, rough negotiating. If we talk about the bigger picture of Iran, I think we should have gone about things with Iran very differently. I do think what happened with the CIA coup was, very wrong and extremely regrettable, and one of many mistakes made through the 20th century of such kind. And I do think we should be finding other ways to engage with the Iranian state and the Iranian people today. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't speak up when we've got situations like that facing Kylie Moore Gilbert and other prisoners. I think in conclusion, we should certainly make a distinction between the people of Iran, who should have our respect and sympathy, and even with the government of Iran, which is struggling in very difficult circumstances. I think we could have a long discussion about which sanctions, if any sanctions, and what political pressure should be applied. There's another larger discussion to be had about nuclear weapons development and how best to counter that. But what I've tried to show with this case is that we're dealing with a state within a state, a military within a military state, with a long history of very cynical, very bloody manipulation of circumstances, most of all against the people of Iran, but also within the region. And this is a tough outfit to deal with. And this is not a case for moral equivalence or denying what is, one case of many of outrageous human rights abuses of which we should speak out.
Okay, Karim, have you got any comment you'd like to make?
Well, not really, but just want to comment on the question of why the current why there is no democracy in Iran, and why Iran is actually the only theocracy in the world. Your guest commented a very crucial point on what happened in 1953, but that wasn't the only case where global forces turned down the Iranian attempts to democracy. Before that, in 1941, as I briefly mentioned, there was a native developmental project run by a strongman, not a democratic man, namely Reza Shah, that the government was delivering for the entire 20 years. The state was highly modernized during his time. Many good things happened, but again, all of that went by the occupation of the country by the global forces, the Britain, US, and then even the Soviet Union. Before that, in 1906, Iranians actually ran a constitutional revolution to actually establish a parliament and democracy, basically. And some of the intellectual of that revolution studied the democracy in the UK to suggest it, the same modern Iran. But unfortunately, that attempt was also, the very revolution was massacred by British and Russian forces, which were dominating the Iranian scene at that point. The Islamists themselves, they were never in the side of the revolutionaries or any kind of leftist, socialist, pro-masses and pro-poor people politics. During the entire Cold War, even even after that, but let's say during the Cold War, they were always in the side of CIA, the United States. And in a larger picture, they have been used against the Soviet Union at that time. But what happened in 1979 cannot be, in Iran, cannot be isolated from all of these interventions in Iran. And well, systematically speaking, the current situation in Iran is the reflection of what happened in the last 100th century.
Okay, thank you very much, Karim. I've got a there's a comment come through about which Greg, you could look at, I think, in the Q&A, just about the right way to talk about Julian Assange, say, compared to Kylie Moore-Gill. But personally, I think it's a distraction. It's a sort of a divide and rule thing to play off one of these victims against another. We have to fight for all these people's rights in the situations they're in. But I've got a bigger question. It's about the very hot moment we had at the start of the year. I think just after General Soleimani was killed, and I think it was a Ukrainian airline was shot down. Hundreds of people were killed there. And there was a bit of a fear around the world that there would be a hot war. I think you referred to that before. So what is it looking like now? Is it a thing we should worry about, that between now and the US elections, this could be triggered again for political purposes in the US context? Or is it more that we should expect for his own reasons, the Trump leadership will try to say that he's a peacemaker, he wants the troops home, and there'll be a sort of toning down of things? Is it the case that, say, the Iranian government would like to see Trump go or stay? I mean, what would they prefer? You think? It's a very weird thing. And of course, Australia is an ally of the US in this, and it must be saying something. But it's not saying it to the public in Australia. So it's good if the Australian public have got a bit more information about what might be happening, I think. If anyone can answer, either Greg or you, Karim.
Well, I can comment on the U.S. election and what's the politics in Iran. I don't think the Iranian decision makers, the Iranian ruling elite, prefer Trump because they were quite happy with the nuclear deal which they had during the Obama administration. Trump rose the tension as large as could he possibly do. I think he would even engage into war against Iran if he could, but the war against Iran was so damaging. Like Iran can bombard the whole Persian Gulf states by this ballistic missiles they have, and by destroying the economic capacity which exists in that region, the whole global economic system would collapse if any tension and war happened in that region. So he had very limited options in attacking Iran, and that's why he preferred to go behind as much as sanction as possible and rally other allies behind his administration. So I don't think the Iranian ruling elites would prefer the re-election of Trump. Would Trump do anything in a large scale from now until the election? I don't think so. There is no time left. There is no capacity left. Even like the situation of the U.S. as a even global power and global hegemony is different from before the pandemic. Now we have the tension between really China and Russia from one side and United States and some other allies on the other hand. So the Iran situation is less important currently until the election, and let's see what will happen after the election.
Okay. Greg, have you got any comment on that question?
Sure. Look, I think there was there's always a risk, but there was a particular risk that Trump may have miscalculated, to the extent that he calculates at all, and triggered a cascading series of events that led to military conflict with Iran. I think that the Iranian government certainly doesn't want that. I don't think the Revolutionary Guard wants that because it would be against their interests. It would be very damaging. We need to bear in mind the human tragedy that was the Iran-Iraq war, 8 years that resolved nothing and just caused immense suffering, and consolidated with the power of the Revolutionary Guard, by the way. I think there needs to be more creative solutions to engage the regime in Tehran. I don't say appease. I think one of the dilemmas is there's not any realistic hope in any short-term way of so-called regime change, but there is a realistic hope of strengthening more moderate elements of the government and serving to empower those more moderate elements to limit the power of the Revolutionary Guard. It's a complicated calculus. I'm not saying anything is simple or easy, but if indeed we don't see a second Trump term, and if we see an administration around Joe Biden, all the indications are that it would be a much more conventional administration and would probably have some very good people in it. And I think that it would, the expectations are it would bring a depth of expertise. Joe Biden himself is an unusual sort of avuncular character, but I think his administration would be very much a change from the current administration, where Trump has never managed to fill his senior administration, or at least the middle tier ranks, and has lost some very good people from the senior ranks. It's not a strong administration. So I think if we had a Biden administration, what would it mean for Iran? It means that there would be an endeavor to look again at how to negotiate with the government in Iran and how to pay attention to this issue I raise of strengthening relatively more moderate elements against the very reactionary elements of the Revolutionary Guard, and engaging in some process of diminishing sanctions in a way that is a pathway out of the current impasse. I think we need to understand, and Karim has alluded to this already, that apart from the longer history of the region, in more recent years, there's been this power contest between an axis around Saudi Arabia, ostensibly a Sunni axis, and an axis around Iran, ostensibly a Shia axis. Of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 opened up a possibility in Iraq, and not just for the Shia majority to get political power, which was, in itself a good thing, but in that destabilized political vacuum, it saw obviously Sunni extremist insurgencies emerge, particularly Al-Qaeda, then Islamic State, but it also saw Iran step in and ironically, to some extent, act in alliance with our own interests against Islamic State and other forces, but of course gain much greater opportunity in Iraq and then in Syria after the civil war. And that's been, extremely concerning. And the Revolutionary Guard and the Quds Force is playing a leading role there. So that dominates the current, power dynamic. It's not simple, and there's not easy options. But I do think we need to find ways of engaging the government in Tehran and trying to strengthen more moderate elements and recognize that, this is in the interest of the people of Iran, it's in the interest of the people of the greater Middle East, it's in the interest of world peace. There's sort of tough work that needs to be done. So I think the question is not who does the regime, or it's a question of which element of the regime. Do you mean the Revolutionary Guard and those around the religious leadership, or do you mean the relatively more moderate parliamentary aspect of the regime? But anyway, it's not a question of whether the regime prefers Trump or Biden. It's a question of what is best for the region and for the world. And I would suggest the best path forth is to break away from this simplistic reductionist approach that says either you're with the Saudi bloc or with the Iranian bloc, and take your side. There's no future for anyone in that. We have to find a way of breaking down the impasse. The regime in Iran is cornered. Its back is against the wall. The most dangerous aspect of the regime is the Revolutionary Guard, and it's prepared to use force and whatever methods it takes in that situation. I think part of the response has to be to de-escalate and provide a way out in a way that's to everyone's benefit.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question, I think, from Jim McElroy. I'll just read it out of the chat. He said, I visited Iran during the Shah's regime and fully understand the reason for the 1979 revolution. The revolution was taken over by the Islamic fundamentalists, unfortunately. Many leftists, minorities, and others have been killed. But to understand the current situation, we have to note the context. Iran faces a massive coalition of enemies led by US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and illegal sanctions which reinforce the undemocratic regime. Lifting the sanctions would be the best way to open the way to a democratic path for Iran and to release the democratic struggle there, including the release of political prisoners such as Kylie Moore Gilbert. Would you comment, please? No. Just similar to what you were saying there at the end there, Greg. But Karim, would you like to respond to Jim or Greg?
I agree with Jim in case that sanctions did no good to the whole Iranian political situation. It just made the Iranian society armless and poorer, and left the regime to be more brutal even against the society. And as I said, in other cases which the societies which they were subject to international sanctions, nothing good came out of that. In a tough situation where sanctions and difficult condition tearing apart the fabric of the society don't go toward democracy and more moderate. They just, I left Iran in 2006 when I was talking to people in Iran in 2009. In only 2 years, like new crimes were introduced to the societies. So tough conditions don't bring democracy anywhere. This wasn't the case in UK. This wasn't the case in Japan. This wasn't the case in anywhere else. Democracy has a different route to be achieved. In terms of, sorry, is there any other point that I have to comment on?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, that's fine.
There's another question. It comes from Stephen, or comment. I am no fan of the Iranian regime, but Noam Chomsky sometimes says that compared to the Saudi regime, just that the Saudi regime is much worse. I don't like comparisons, but it does help to keep things in proportion. I dislike the demonization of Iran, which is one way of paving the path to war, which would help no one and would be, as Karim says, I think, a disaster. So there's a comment if anyone wants to comment back.
Sure. Look, it's a good comment. It's difficult to argue with. I mean, so in a sense, there's not much to say. That's it's very sort of astute observation. But I guess the thing to unpack here is that I agree with Karim that sanctions haven't yielded the result we want in Iran. They've been really tough for the people of Iran. Of course, it's the people of Iran who have suffered very badly. People sometimes say that sanctions don't work in terms of their primary objective of limiting economic opportunity. That's not entirely the case with Iran. The sanctions have hit very, very hard, but it's ordinary Iranians who have been most hard hit, and the Revolutionary Guard in these perverse conditions have done okay. They benefit from the tough conditions. They control the black market, the smuggling, but ordinary Iranians are it's very hard done by. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help the cause of trying to promote sensible political path forward, just to keep using this very blunt instrument. And I think one of the tragedies of the Trump administration is, out of heartlessness and lack of insight, lack of real moral concern, it's pushed ahead with this very blunt instrument. But also, it's played this very simplistic game of either you're with Saudi Arabia or you're with Iran in the region. And Saudi Arabia, the sanctions haven't helped make things better in Iran. Cozying up uncritically to the Saudi regime hasn't helped either. There was, a momentary glimmer of hope that when Mohammed bin Salman was announced as crown prince, that might be the beginning of a younger, demographic change towards a more progressive and more open Saudi Arabia. But Mohammed bin Salman has proven himself to be a ruthless and immoral leader, acting unwisely, acting with just complete disregard for the human rights of Saudi citizens. Of course, there's the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but of many others as well. The constant use of intimidation. Even calling in the elites, political and economic elites of Saudi, and basically telling them that you'll suffer the same fate if you don't give me what I want. Now, that's no way to reinvent the Saudi economy. That's just completely counterproductive. And to the extent that sort of Western alliance with Saudi Arabia strengthens those impulses, then that's not good for anyone, least of all the people of Saudi Arabia and the people of the Middle East in general. So we need to find a way of not playing this, foolish binary game of choosing enemies and friends, and my enemy's enemy being my friend. That's really produced horrible results from the Middle East in particular. And I agree, of course, that demonizing Iran doesn't make sense. Just like we should be cautious about demonizing Saudi Arabia or the people of Saudi Arabia, or demonizing China, the people of China. But we're dealing with elements of regimes that are particularly problematic that we want to be critical about, and we want to suggest a path forward. We're not demonizing entire nations, or even necessarily speaking broadly of governments. We're identifying the particular problem elements and saying, what can we do that will make things better to help those who are trying to bring about change?
Thank you. I think I'll just make a comment on my own now, because the way I perceive what Trump has done was all about a domestic political agenda, undoing Obama's legacy, whatever. It was mostly it, I think, and the there's really no thought for what happens to the people of Iran. I don't think those sort of hyper-strategic people like Bannon and whatever extent Trump is one, think that the Iranian people, or they don't seem to think the Iranian people have got any role to play in changing their own society. And you know, there's various assessments of how much upheaval there is inside the country, but I'm pretty sure there's been, you know, several years now since late 2017, pretty well rolling bigger and bigger waves of strikes and rallies and protests, which have very much frightened the government. So surely this is an element in the picture for change for the better, which no one's really wanting to connect to very much. But, you know, these different, like Europe, North America, even Australia. Is there any view you've got, either of you, about that aspect?
Just a note of caution, Peter. I mean, I don't doubt that the people of Iran want to see a more open society, and they want to see justice, and they certainly want to see life getting back to a more normal situation economically and every other respect. It's reasonable to assume that there's a strong desire for a more accountable government system. There's a strong desire for more personal freedom. You know, that we can reasonably read from what we understand that top-down imposition of a certain approach to imposing religiosity for political purposes is you know, very much, yeah. And you know, you could say in a sense there's a groundswell for democracy. I mean, it's more complicated than that. But the note of caution is this: that if we think that standing on the wings and cheering on sort of people rising up is necessary in their interest, we need to be very cautious, because we see completely ruthless force applied to intimidate and to frighten those who would speak out. So we need to think very carefully about how best to open up a way forward, not just for the people of Iran, but for the government of Iran, so that more moderate elements can predominate to a larger extent, and more reactionary and more harsh elements will have less opportunity to completely hold sway. That sounds like it's compromise, but you know, it's compromise in the sense that I think an idealistic approach that says we just get behind the people and support their uprising doesn't understand the price that people will pay and how likely it is that such hopes will be thwarted in the most cruel fashion. We need to be more intelligent about how we help them.
Karim, any comment on that?
Yes, the protests in Iran are actually increasing. The first mass protest happened during the time of Khatami, when he claimed to be a reformist president in late 1990s. Yeah, he was elected as president in 97. And since then, we started to see like mass protests happening. First each decade, but now each 2-3 years. And if there was no pandemic, actually just before the start of pandemic, there was a massive protest, which in all of them, the regime responded brutally. But again, the protests are becoming more violent. There is one thing to say about the protests is just these are mostly people who disadvantaged, have nothing to lose, and came to the street to demand democracy, better conditions, better economic conditions and economic prosperity, and so on. But there, in terms of political alternative to alter the current regime, there is no organic opposition inside Iran. Unfortunately, the opposition which is outside Iran is mostly, how can I put it, like they are receiving money from different states. Now even Saudi Arabia and Israel came to support some of this so-called opposition, and even creating their own Farsi-speaking TV channels. But unfortunately, all of this media do not reflect what people organically need inside Iran. And the native need of the Iranian people. All of this, unsurprisingly, of course, all of this TV channels and the money spent on the opposition outside is to reflect the interest of this states who supporting this political forces. Sometimes they speak language which people inside Iran, they don't even understand. I mean, they are speaking about something that people can't relate to, showing foods that people can't relate to inside Iran, and talking about some values which are not really urgent in Iran, and things like that. So, I mean, as Greg said, finding a way to genuinely help Iranian people to overcome their current situation and their current political establishment is really the big task and the big challenge here.
Okay.
Peter, I think I completely agree with what Karim is saying. I think we need to, just put this in the broader context and remember that our optimism about the Arab Spring, so-called, in 2011, it didn't end as we hoped. And it's not because people protesting weren't sincere and brave and courageous. And it's not that we were, wrong to wish them well. But we need to recognize how hard it is to bring about the changes that everyone desires. The tragedy of the Arab Spring lives on today in Syria in the most horrible way, and in a way that's not as horrible, but pretty awful in Egypt. It's only in Tunisia we've seen something relatively promising occur. Yeah. But it speaks to how dangerous it is to think that it's just a question of getting behind democratic uprisings and supporting them, and everything will come out right. It's tougher than that. And if we don't think realistically, as Karim is suggesting, we'll end up perhaps for the best of reasons, but perhaps with the worst of results, not helping things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's one more question. Again from Jim McElroy. He's asking for a comment specifically on the role of Israel in demonizing Iran, including the nature of the recent UAE deal in consolidating the anti-Iran bloc. So it's a little bit too terse, probably, the way he's put it, but can you pick up on that?
I think when we speak about, we speak about any country, including a democracy, and of course Israel is a democracy. Even in a democracy, it makes sense. We know this in Australia, not to speak in singular terms. So it's a peculiarity of Israeli history that the Knesset is structured the way it is. Many would say that, with the wisdom of hindsight, it should have been structured differently because it gives outsized power to small voices. And the current government of Benjamin Netanyahu reflects some of those dynamics. So it is true that in Netanyahu's government, there has been an element, and it's not just in Netanyahu's government, it goes beyond him, but let's sort of put it in the focus. There's an element that really fixates on Iran and pushes anything which pushes back against Iran. Now, there are more nuanced readings that recognize that Iran has, targeted Israel in particular ways, and that there's reasons for Israel to be concerned. I think we need to accept that. But there is a kind of simple zero-sum calculation that goes around with some political actors in Israel and some in Washington and elsewhere, that says either you're with our team supporting the way we do things and Iran's the enemy, or you're part of the problem. I think it's actually good in abstract terms that diplomatic relationships can be established across the region. I think it's better to have dialogue and diplomatic exchange than not to have it. So the fact that there should be diplomatic avenues between the UAE and Israel is it's potentially a very good thing, but of course it depends at how it's done and what else comes in that process. And I don't argue against the Israeli concern about Iran, but I think that a simplistic pushing of of an analysis that says, well, better we line up with the Saudis and go against the Iranians because otherwise it's going to be awful, fails to see the complexity that we're talking about, and doesn't even reflect the full range of opinions within Israeli democracy itself.
Okay. Karim?
May I talk about different aspect of the question, which I don't think it's only demonization when it's come to Israel policies toward Iran. And also this is relevant to what we're talking today, because I'm not convinced that Dr. Gilbert is a spy or anything, but we also have to sometimes give the benefit of the doubt to the Iranian ruling elite, the regime, which Iran is currently a state with very few friends around the world and with too many enemies around the world. Both Israel and Saudi Arabia have long history of sabotage, sabotage, assassination, and terrorist activities inside Iran. And what one could imagine that they couldn't do that without the help of some local people. So they are interested to have spies there. Both Saudi Arabia and Israel, if we look at the Iranian Iraqi war, which started in 1981, and we see the amount of financial and other type of support that Saudi Arabia gave Iraq, we can also consider that war that war as a proxy war which Saudi Arabia waged against Iran. So there is a long history of conflict, actual conflict between these states from both sides, and that shouldn't be neglected and just. I totally agree with Greg. It's helped no one that we divide the region into two camps, Iranian camp and Saudi Arabian camp, and okay, let's decide which camp to support. This just enters us into a unending conflict. There is no end in sight to this. But also when it comes to conflict is two sides, and Israel and Saudi Arabia are the stronger party. They have more means to push against Iran, both violently in terms of intelligence and demonization. In terms of media, Iran have nothing to say when it comes against Saudi Arabia or to Saudi Arabia and Israel. But both states are even strong in terms of media. Saudi Arabia owns more than 50% of the entire Middle Eastern media, and that includes media which are operating based on Farsi and Urdu and different languages than mere Arabic media. The second and third media shareholders in the region are Qatar and UAE, which are very close to Saudi Arabia's policies when it comes to Iran. Israel also is powerful in terms of using media as part of, let's say, propaganda war. Iran has nothing to say in this field. So, the dynamic of the conflict there is from both sides. It's not only fault of one this side. It's very common among Iranian commentators and Farsi-speaking commentators to say the Iranian ruling elite are doing what they are doing because they are idiots. I don't think they are idiots, and idiocy helps no one, or idiocy is not the right tool to understand any foreign policy. As basically, the Iranian ruling elites are doing what they are doing. Most of the time, it's unconventional and strange, because that's the only means they have, including using proxy Shia fighters and others. But the history of the conflict of Israel and Saudi Arabia and what they are doing and pushing toward conflicts against Iran must not be neglected from any analysis when it comes to the Middle East.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much. We don't have any more comments coming through, and we're up to 8:05, so I'll move to wrap it up. I want to give a heartfelt thanks to both Karim and Greg for your inputs tonight. It's a hard area actually to engage. and it's one that's very important that more Australians talk about and get informed about. Let's just announce the topic for next week. No, sorry, it's a fortnight. On Tuesday, the 6th of October, it's on the US elections. Is Trump versus democracy the real issue? Our speaker at the moment is Jonathan Lockhart. He's a US freelance journalist, and we're looking for a second speaker to join that program still. So we'll be advertising that, and I hope we will do that live in the Hotel Harry in Surrey Hills, and hopefully people will be feeling more confident about coming out as the pandemic is more suppressed in Australia, as it seems to be the evidence at the moment. So once again, thank you very much, everybody. The video from tonight will be on the YouTube channel and the website of politicsinthepub.org.au. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Peter. It was a
Thanks,
pleasure.
Peter. Thanks, Karim.
Okay.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.